So thank you, everybody, for coming today again to the second part of Beyond Dispute about the teaching Israel in the 21st century and its challenges, and I would say its beauty too. This part, the second part, would be focusing on the relationship between Israel and its diaspora. How do you teach that connection, and where do you have to start? And I think most of Dr. Sinclair's video really, I think, focused on that, mainly on Jewish education in the diaspora and in America. So I'd like to start by asking you a question. Most of you, all of you, grew up in America, and when you grew up, I mean, I know you grew up in a different maybe decades, but what was your feeling about, and even if you didn't grow up Jewish, what was your feeling about the connection between Jews who live in Israel or Israelis and Jews who live in the diaspora? And I think actually, if you didn't grow up Jewish, it's another angle that would be nice to hear. How did you see? That's a third angle. How did you see that connection and responsibility between the two communities? So, who would like to start?
I can say that I knew absolutely nothing about Israel as a young person until the UN declaration, until that point.
Right.
Otherwise, I had no connection whatsoever. I don't even think I had ever heard of Israel, although how could I not have? But I had no conscious recognition of it as a place.
How old were you? How old were you?
Well, and I was born in 1933, and the UN declaration was what, 1947, 48, 47, 48. So, I was, how old will you figure it out? I can't do the math. It's 33, 43.
Yeah, you're 14.
15,
you're
16.
Just about,
Yeah.
But
And I knew that many people, I mean, the Second World War was fought at our dinner table, to the extent that one could fight a war at the dinner table, because my father brought it to the dinner table every night. He was so desirous he was already in his middle 40s, and he wanted very much to go and fight, and he couldn't. He was too old. And that was my recognition of, any recognition of connection to Jewishness was there. And nowhere else.
Wow. And over the years since then, how did your perception change or develop?
Completely different. And most of my friends were Jew, my close friends were Jewish, but non-observant, with one exception, and I wasn't aware of her observance, except that there were certain foods that she didn't eat. In college, I began to be more aware, but then when I became, more interested in the opposite sex and in what was going to happen to me, in dating people and thinking about getting married and so on and so forth. My first husband was Jewish, but again, there was very little connection with Israel. It wasn't until I moved, this is much too long a story, to Morningside Gardens, which was a Mitchell Lama housing development, 1 block above Jewish Theological Seminary. And practically everybody on our floor had a connection to the seminary. So that really began my,
wow.
The depth of my identity was already strongly in the direction of being Jewish. There was no
Yeah.
question about that.
Yeah.
But I didn't have any sense of really of what it meant.
Yeah.
One family on the floor, that was the first time I had ever been to a Shabbat dinner. I was already 21 years old. And they went to Israel all the time. They had family there. I mean, and things happened. Eventually, I married Marshall, whose family, whose mother came from Palestine.
Yeah.
So the connection changed through the years because I was always on the extreme left, really quite extreme left. I was always probably critical. That criticalness changed, certainly. And it has changed more and more. I'm more and more, although still critical, more and more sympathetic, and more have a strong feelings about it. I mean, we went quite a few, not that many times, but a couple of times.
So where do you see the point of maybe the turning point between being extremely critical and maybe more favorable?
What what I've left out is my professional development. By accident, I became a Jewish early childhood educator and known for that. That was why I was hired at Bank Street, because I was bringing that to the table. So, and I became very involved in Jewish early childhood education, and it means a lot to me. I wrote a book about it. So,
Right. Yeah.
So I do feel that it's very important, and that the love absolutely has to come first. I wouldn't teach
Right.
4 and 5 year olds, I wouldn't go into what he went into about the map and about, sharing. It's enough to talk to them about sharing on a daily basis in the classroom, not bringing Israel into the picture when you're 5 years old. But there are other ways to bring it into the picture. And for me, this topic is extremely relevant because we at Tiferet Israel are considering starting a Hebrew school. So this is a very important topic.
Yeah, very, very important. Well, he said that rabbis shy away from speaking about Israel. I don't know how you perceive me speaking about Israel, but I don't have any issue speaking about Israel. I mean, when it's relevant, I don't bring it all the time because it's, it's not always relevant to our conversation. But, as being Israeli, I don't really have that issue.
I'll add my perception. Sorry.
Yeah, but just the fact that I am considered in the category of Israeli diaspora, this is a new phenomenon, because up until 1948, right, there was diaspora and there was Israel. And then since then, a whole generation, couple of generations already have grown up as Israelis, and they move and live outside Israel. So they are now becoming an Israeli diaspora, which is a totally different animal. So it's an interesting, I mean, it existed over the years, over the centuries, but not in this, magnitude. And especially because the communication levels are so advanced now that it almost like it doesn't matter today, almost where you live, you can always video conference with your family and be in touch and know what's going on in the news. So I think it of course brings about challenges too, not just advantages, because the communication is so fast. Then to try to now, first of all, shield or shelter kids from the news, it used to be a lot easier. But today they hold the news in their hand. And if it's not directed and explained, I think, that's why I think that connection, it's so important right now, because it's even the Jewish people as in numbers are half in Israel and half in the diaspora. So it really is a kind of a moment where to really almost we have to connect it and make it establish what is our policy for each other. So I wanted to ask you first before we bring the sources and from the those scholars. So any other experience of yes, Adrian, if you can unmute.
Well, I came from a completely secular family. Israel was never mentioned. I was born in 44. So I remember being, and I didn't go to Hebrew school. As a teenager, I was involved in the United Synagogue Youth. And that's where I first had my first hearing about Israel. And I remember the kids, I was 16, 17, 8, no, probably, 16, 18, something like that. They wanted to go to Israel and they wanted to make Aliyah. And I remember asking my parents if I can just go to Israel on a trip to Israel because the USY was sponsoring one. And they said, my father, who had no money, said, get a job. And well, that was the end of that discussion. I was busy with household responsibilities, so we knew that wasn't going to happen. So that was the end of Israel. But I do remember hearing people say things that Israel really didn't think very positively of Americans, that they felt sometimes Americans, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but I remember hearing comments. I don't know if anybody has any recollection of that, Israel felt that the Americans were, you send us money, but you're not going to, that's it. That's all you're going to do for us.
That's a good segue to actually where we're gonna start. Yes, there is such a notion of, we like you over there, but we don't like you here. We will come and do fundraising or we'll look for cheerleading, but we're not really going to consider your opinion when it comes to stuff in Israel.
Right.
That is definitely there, and we'll talk about specific actually example. Anybody, what about the responsibility that did you feel that you have any responsibility to the Jews who live in Israel, to the Israelis? Because I'll tell you why. When I was growing up, there was no doubt that we, as the state of Israel, are responsible or will somehow try to help in any way to the Jews in the diaspora. And don't forget, most Israelis, or pretty much all the Israelis that established the modern state, were from the diaspora and felt the diaspora. So definitely there was, from our perspective, absolutely. And when I was in the army, that was the mindset. We are the army of the Jewish people, not just of Israelis. So from the other side, it would be interesting to hear that. So I think Ellen and then Susan.
Yeah, so I grew up in Queens, and my family had a loyalty to Israel. I grew up thinking it was like my second home, even though I hadn't been there. We had relatives who had gone there after, from Eastern Europe and had settled there, and we had to send them clothing and care packages a couple of times a year. They lived on a farm, and, they just, obviously, they needed help from time to time. And the thing that happened was, when I was 19, my family went to Israel for the first time. And I was a little bit shocked because I didn't feel at home. I felt like this was very foreign to me. And so that was a bit of a jolt, just that it wasn't like America. It was very different. And I went back a second time and I felt a little more acclimated. That was 2 years ago. But the thing that happened is about when I was in my 50s, it was the first time I encountered Jewish people who talked about giving the Palestinians a state. And that shocked me, that Jewish people could actually consider that. And I was already a doctor, and I was already, 50 something years old. And I never kind of got to accept that we would actually let the Palestinians take some of our land and make a state there. So it's kind of a confusing, and I never felt at home, but my second trip I felt a lot more comfortable than when I was 19. I just was shocked that I wasn't like at home, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So I want to just point out a couple of things, and then we can get to the first source. It's very interesting the way that we live today between the center in Israel and the center in the United States. And I'm going to focus on American Jewry, because I think our sources concentrate on that too. And plus, these are the main centers of the Jewish people today. And it really resembles our history of Israel and Babylonia after the first exile. And I would say it manifests itself in education itself, because what was the result of the two communities? Two Talmuds. And a Talmud is education. This is Jewish education. So I think I would say I want to start there, because if you're talking about Jewish education and as it pertains to Israel and the diaspora, it's already there. We have the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. And if I would teach Israel, I would start there, not just in the sense of saying there are two Talmud, and then we should look at how they develop, but what are the differences between the Talmuds and what they taught about each other? And I think it's all there. So I'd like to summarize it in 2 sentences. And then I think that would be a good segue into our sources, and then give one example from today. So if we look at the 2 separate Talmuds, they represent the different 2 communities and the different in the education, in the sense of, first of all, they concentrate on themselves. Okay, so let's start there. I would say this did not change. American Jews still care about where they are the most, and Israelis care about where they live and where they exist for the most part. People have different identification, but for the most part, what Israel did in modern times, it gave dual citizenship, and not every country allows it, but it did it because most of Israeli citizens have connections in the diaspora. So that's one thing. The second thing is to allow the egalitarian prayers. That's what we're dealing with right now. But Israel passed a bill years ago that basically states, and I'll read the way it's written. It says it's called the nation state bill, to make Israel a nation state. It's not just the state of Israel, but it's for the nation of the Jewish nation. And it says the state of Israel will take action to maintain connections between the state and the Jewish people wherever they are. So it in a sense, it's saying we're not going to override the government that you live under. And we know the famous example of Netanyahu speaking in Congress, about Iran. So, but that doesn't necessarily, over the years, didn't happen as much. But on the other hand, we will do everything possible to protect your interest and to be there for you. I would just return for a minute to the Talmuds, the other difference between the two Talmuds, besides looking into where their environment, is the sovereignty. Sovereignty is the key element here. And it's not just between American Jews and Israelis, but this has been the issue since forever. So since the first exile, this community lived outside the land, this community lived in the land, but they had limited sovereignty on both ends, even those who stayed in Israel. But when we bring it to today, Israeli Jews have sovereignty, which gives them a lot of benefits as Jews, but it also gives them responsibility that diaspora Jews don't have. So when they speak, just like in the Babylonian Talmud, a lot of it is in a sense not necessarily practical, right? It's more philosophical. So for American Jews to speak about Israel, first of all, they have to be very educated, but I think they have to, and this is the key element, and then we'll end with this, they have to understand, and I agree with what Dr. Sinclair said, the idea of the experience is the key. Is not just to say, oh, we know about Israel, we know politics, we know we're very educated people in general. But if you don't feel Israel, then you're never going to see it in a rational way, because it's not rational. The situation in Israel is not a rational situation. It's so complex that you have to love Israel first before you try to delve into this experience. So if it was up to me, I would say to diaspora Jews and to the Jews in Israel, and that I say that all the time, you have to work together because you need each other. The Jews in the diaspora has this vulnerability of always being a dual citizen in many ways. And then Israelis also live in a tough environment, and it needs the help of diaspora Jews wherever they can get it too. So we are one body for sure. And I was going to say, we're not doing each other a favor. We are in it together, and let's start looking from that perspective. But of course, I don't decide all the education programs, but yeah. So if anybody has, Elaine?
I just want to say something. When all is said and done, was not Israel formed and born to house any person who's looking for a permanent home who is Jewish? Isn't
Right.
that the very bottom line of everything?
Yeah.
That even Americans who are making Aliyah are leaving their country to go to Israel. So shouldn't we think about that that's their prime reason for
Of course,
living?
that's a big commitment that should
Yeah.
be on both sides. Yeah, Susan, you wanted to say something before.
Let's ask you something about how that you said when you were in the military, how that you felt like at that time that the Israelis had a commitment to Jews in the diaspora, and I just wanted to know how that how does that show up? What does that mean? Like they would try to protect us or whatever. I don't understand the practical aspect of that.
Yeah, so I personally was I was part of a rescue unit that went all over the world to rescue people from explosions and disasters and all that. So we did it for non-Jews, but we were for Jewish communities. We were right there. For example, when the Israeli embassy in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, was blown up, Israelis were there right away. If a Jewish congregation was attacked, the prime minister of Israel would immediately say something, or the local Israeli embassy or consulate would be there if it needs support. If there's something happens, and you see, like now in Ukraine, Israelis were there first. They established a hospital there. They went to get all the people that they could to come to Israel, the Jews of Ukraine, to come to Israel. So there wasn't perfect process, but nonetheless, there was a process there. So absolutely, the mindset of it, but even before the army, the mindset was that Israelis and the Jews in the diaspora are one. From our perspective, there's no issue, because also remember, Israelis are children of diaspora or from themselves, from the diaspora. So we know we're connected to the diaspora. That we don't have any doubt about that. What we do is, like you mentioned before, somebody mentioned here, we like you there, but we're not going to accept necessarily your conversion documents. We're not going to listen to you if you want an egalitarian coattail, but in general, definitely there's the connection that we're one. So the question is, how do you bring that same sentiment to children in America, I think, that are growing up here, to have the same commitment that Israeli Jews have towards the Jews in the diaspora?
Do you think Israeli Jews still have that?
Absolutely.
You think the current, do you think currently that exists the way you're talking about?
No, it's not the same. It's not the same. It's definitely still there. It's not the same. Because, and I would point to two major elements that I see that why it's not there is the same way. It's there, but not the same way. One is economical. When Israel was established, and over the past 70 years, not even 70, I would say 50 years, until about the 90s, Israel was still struggling economically, and it needed the support of the diaspora Jews that were more in numbers too.
Yeah.
But now Israel is a powerhouse economically, socially, I mean, everything, in almost any way. So it doesn't feel like it needs the support necessarily of the Jewish community in the United States. The other aspect of it is that Israel is a world player now. So it needs the governments of the countries and the states, but not necessarily the Jewish communities. It went beyond the Jewish communities and the countries and the states. So it definitely needs the support of the United States, but it doesn't as much need necessarily the Jewish money. It always would need the support in Congress in every way it can, but it's not standing with its hand out anymore. And especially for the generation of my nieces and nephews, they definitely are not in that mindset. They love the United States. They love, the Jews in the diaspora, but they almost feel like the Jews in the diaspora at this point need Israel more than Israel needs the Jews in the diaspora in some ways. So I think we're just at this point, also because the sheer numbers of Jews, Israel and diaspora, and because where we are now in history, that Israel is almost kind of a partner to the United States, not even though the size is minuscule compared to the United States, but in terms of what Israel fills for the purpose that Israel fills for the United States and in the world politics, it's not the weak cousin anymore that needs the protection.
Right.
Much.
Yeah.
So I think these were the two reasons. Adrian and then Paul.
Let Paul go because I spoke already.
Okay.
Well, two things. One, do you think that Israel thinks of itself as the leader of the Jewish people as opposed to Jews in the diaspora? That's my first question. And the second is a comment. I have this, I'm sure it's right, I have this recollection as a school child having a tin cup where we collected for Israel. Is that right? I mean, does anybody
Yes.
remember that?
Yeah, Israel's national fund.
The pushka, yes,
Yeah.
there was in my husband's house, definitely, which was very Israel oriented.
Yes, in my house too.
So,
Someone
but I was
collected.
not raised to think of Israel as the center of the Jewish people. I don't think it was not even a question that was asked. It was just that Jews were thought of as surviving in their communities in these different countries. And ironically, Francis is the first one is in 1985 said we should make a trip to Israel. I had never been.
And
And
how
second
old
of
were you
all,
then?
when
How
he
old were
was about 19 or so, he was his mother was born Jewish and raised Catholic and very devout Catholic. And as a rebellion against his parents, he went to Israel with his brother and went to a kibbutz. He and his brother both went to kibbutzes. See him in 1968 or 9, something like that. And then that was a direct, and that was before the influx of Jews into France, the Russian influx. But he definitely did it as a thumbs to the nose to his parents of going to Israel.
Wow.
When he discovered that his grandmother, his mother's mother, was Jewish. He used to see her praying in the attic and benching and shuffling, and he and his brother sort of spied on her. And his brother asked him, "Oh, why was she doing that?" Francis came up with a very primitive explanation, which I will not share, but having to do with bodily functions. But she never went to church with them. So France has a long history of having ambivalent feelings about the Jews that live in France.
Well, of course, that's again, we're going back to that dual citizenship that Israel will always have and always been blamed for, that they can't be fully loyal to the country that they live in because they'll always have this superseding loyalty to Israel. Or to
Is that it? But it also is
the Jewish people.
Is it in the back of my mind, I'm hearing "stranger in a strange land." That's about Jews, right?
Of course, that's what it's about. But let me ask you something. I wanted, because you mentioned something. you said, so when you were growing up, you felt that Israel was the center of Judaism?
No,
No, that
No.
America was.
I was a kid. We didn't, we weren't, I mean, I did go to Hebrew school. I was bar mitzvah, but I mean, we did study the creation of the Jewish state of Israel,
Okay.
but I don't remember, there was never a presentation, which I think is very important, about Jews in the world and the migration of Jews from the destruction of the Second Temple into the whole world, and where they found homes and where they were welcomed. I mean, I remember vaguely reading something about the Ottoman Empire, when it needed to raise money, welcomed Jews because they, you know, and this whole thing about Jews being bankers. Well, you know, it's because Jews were all over the world. And, you know, if you needed money and, you know, you were in Germany or in France and you needed US dollars, you just call your cousin or wire your cousin and say, you know, I have a client who needs money. Can you lend him money? And it was this is one big family of Jews doing banking and having access to assets that, you know, Christians didn't.
Right,
They were
because in a sense, Jews are a union that are represented
an
in all
international
countries, in
union.
all- of course, and that has always been one, our strength, but on the other hand, our vulnerability, because every anti-Semite that ever existed, from Pharaoh through Hitler, accused us in the same thing. Haman, oh, they're one people, but they're all over, and they have the secret network, and they're controlling everything, and they're gonna take everything away from us. It's the same all the time. You know, history does not repeat itself, like Mark Twain said, but it rhymes. With that, yeah, Miriam, and then we'll look at the first source.
Obviously, my experience is pretty different from everyone here. The candy store that was opposite the Catholic church I went to was owned by Jews, and those are the only Jews that I knew of in my community.
So you had a sweet experience.
Penny candy, that's right. When I was at Columbia, we had the OT class was very small, and there was a very observant Jewish girl in the class who I became friendly with. And so that was in 1973. That was the first time I heard the term Hashoah. I had no idea what it meant.
Wow. 1973.
Yeah, 72,
Wow.
73. That's when I first heard the term.
Wow. Wow. You knew about the Holocaust? You didn't hear the word Shoah? Or you just did not know anything
I'm
really
not
about
even sure how much the term Holocaust was was being bandied about in Staten Island at that time.
Wow. Wow. That's amazing. I mean, it really is. So in one sense, we think that our education level is deteriorating, but in one sense, even if it's deteriorating, but because communication is so available now, that even if you hear a little bit, you still hear more than someone in 1973 heard.
Well, you know,
Some way.
my great niece know the
Can I
books
just
too.
finish?
Can I just?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Menachem and Elizabeth. Elizabeth was raised in a town right near where I lived in Staten Island, and we discovered this. We found out, went to the same high school, same grammar school, and we had the same teachers. And obviously she's Jewish, and I wish she was here because I'd be curious as to what her experience was being a Jew in Staten Island, right near where I live. But I wanted to take it away from that. Right now in modern times, what is the continuum allowed for criticism of Israel and Israelis? where did, I mean, this is called.
I would say this is what I said before. It's you can criticize all the way to the point where you still understand it's yours. That if you're gonna stab this body, you're stabbing yourself. That to me is the line. It's when you send darts at, or more than that, arrows into this flesh called Israel to criticize that much that it's gonna bleed. You're not doing yourself a favor and you're not doing anybody a favor. So that's why people in Israel, when they hear this criticism that goes beyond what their reality, what they see and experience in their reality, they're very concerned about that, because they're saying, what in a sense, if someone, there's an expression in Hebrew, rachok me'ayin, rachok me'halev, far from the eye, far from the heart. So it means that because you live far away, your heart is really not with us. And that's really, where the issue on the Israeli side, when they hear that criticism, you can criticize as much as you want, but don't forget, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot too. Because if you think that you are separate from the Jewish body, history showed us that we're not. Even my parents had to leave an Arab country because of Hitler in Europe, then Jews coming to Israel, fighting with the local Arabs, and then the Jews in Arab countries couldn't stay anymore because they had tension, because the Arab communities were seeing as the Jews in Israel fighting against their brethren. So we're all somehow connected one way or another. And that's, I would make that the point of my education, the bottom line. Then now say whatever you want. Yeah. Adrian?
I sometimes when I hear people speaking, and I know Israel, there are faults, there are warts on the frog, but sometimes I wonder, when I hear criticism, is that a veiled way of being anti-Semitic? Where does the criticism have value and legitimacy? And is the legitimacy being helpful to those who are anti-Semitic?
Well, I would say the Jewish people is traumatized. And I think that should be also a point of view. The Jews who live in Israel are traumatized. They come from traumas all over the world, and then have been traumatized by wars and complexity in Israel. So let's start there. When you see a person that is suffering, are you going to, beat them up? Yes, that person now has got some physical strength and, economical strength and all that. But the traumas are still there. And the traumas of Jews who live in the diaspora are still there. We're not that removed from it. So when we speak about each other and to each other, this is where I would say, like, you speak to yourself or something that is be compassionate, understand the traumas and the history. Yeah. You can say everything, really. I would say you can say everything, and you should be able to say everything, because we live in a free, at least the two societies, the Israeli and the American society, are free societies, hopefully for many years. But we have to be able to say everything. But even when you say things, I would say a lot of times it's the tone that is the worst than what is said. And that tone is what I was referring to before, that the tone of estrangement, like, you're there, what are you doing? It's like the child, the wicked child in the Haggadah, that why is he a wicked and not wise? The difference between their questions and criticism in a sense, if you look at the text, is not that great, not big. It really not. But why? Because the wicked says to you. What is it to you? It takes themselves out of the community. And I would say, as long as you understand that you are part of it and that your body is also traumatized, like all the Jewish body, and we have to heal each other, I think from that standpoint, you can say pretty much, and I'm not just saying it in philosophically. Last week, I gave the example that we started studying about the Holocaust when we were in second grade. So at 7 years old, at least that's what when I was growing up, that was the age that they started. And I remember saying to myself, humanity sunk so low that from now we just have to be good. So the one mystery that I still have in my mind, but I understand it comes from trauma, that we are still not kind to each other as Jews. That's the one question I have. Everything else I can understand and explain and have education about, but I can't understand if you look at Jewish history and you experience Jewish history and you're a Jewish descendant, or we're all Jews by choice at this point. If you call yourself Jewish and you identify with the Jewish story, how can you be bad to each other? Like the gay community, like how can you be nasty to each other after what we've been through, and to be recognized and to take it for granted now? Women, you can say women, why women are nasty to each other still, shouldn't women be helping each other? So I think any marginalized community, and we are considered a marginalized community in the world, I would say that's really the shift. And from there, you can say whatever you want. So it's that experience. So should we do, I think this is a source that Dr. Sinclair's source, I want to share that. We can read it together. And even if we just do this source, would be good. By the way, I meant to tell you that even in the guidebook that I'm using for this lesson, for the series, it says that this session would be longer, would be 2.5 to 3 hours, something like that, which means that by splitting it, we just basically, that they recommend basically to make it longer or split it. Let me share the screen here. Okay. Who would like to read that? Anne, would you like to?
Okay. The title is Towards an Israel Education of Direction, Not Connection, and Responding to Israel's Direction, Clarifications and Responses. And now comes the part where I have to say some things that people won't like. Israel is moving in a worrying, disturbing, depressing direction. Religiously, a fundamentalist Judaism is utterly alien to mainstream American Jewry. It is taking increasing hold of the country's institutions, communities, and ways of thinking. Politically, the parties on the right and center right are more and more tribal, jingoistic, and dismissive of minority rights, whether these be Jewish or non-Jewish minorities. Culturally, while there is an extraordinary and breathtaking creativity in Israeli art, cinema, TV, song, and literature, there is also a closed-mindedness, an inability to see opposing points of view, a peculiarly Israeli blend of arrogance and ignorance when it comes to anything outside the accepted narratives. You know, yeah, one of the sentences didn't read properly for me, but nonetheless, what he's saying is very clear. I'm reminded of when I was talking to you, Gadi, about a book I was reading in the Israeli lit group I belong to. It was a book by a Palestinian, Christian Arab, Palestinian author. We read one book a year by a Palestinian called Arabics. And you said you had read it in 10th grade. That book is no longer part of the curriculum in Israeli high school.
Yeah.
A lot of things that were once the curriculum in Israeli education have been completely eliminated that have to do with the so-called other.
Yes. But on the other hand, I would say that Israel, because it opened up globally, that everything is open. You know, this is there's no policy to limit some, you know, in the education system. I'm sure depends on what school you go to. You know, they have the religious, right? The religious system, the education system, the secular education system, and now with all the private education system. So, for example, the conservative movement has its own school system in Israel. It's called the Tali schools, and they're supposed to teach more egalitarianism and more religious pluralism, which, of course, this is part of the tension between Israel and the diaspora. One cause of this difference, of course, as we mentioned earlier, is sovereignty. So, for example, it's easier in America to be religiously pluralistic because it doesn't necessarily, and again, I'm not talking about how it translates to Congress. That's a different story. That's the political arena. But in the neighborhoods and everywhere else, nobody has sovereignty over the other here in America. But in Israel, the religious authorities have the separation of state and religion and state is not as clear as here, and it really does not exist like it exists here. So religious authorities have real authority on the country. And in the country. So that's a big difference. Yeah, I think Susan had her hand a split.
Okay,
Just,
that's fine.
You could say that this split you're talking about is not existing so much here right now either.
Right.
Right. No, it does.
Right.
It exists here, but more because how it affects then the political. So in a sense, yes, in a sense but here it's not direct.
No,
it's not direct.
It's
In
more,
Israel, religious parties have religious institutions, religious streams have political parties in the parliament.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and then when they get the coalition to succumb because they need their seats to succumb to religious, I would say, narrowness, you know, then of course it has direct effect. Here in America, the religious people support, let's say now with Roe v. Wade, especially what's going on now. Yes, they have eventually the influence, but they're not directly in it.
All right.
it's just more subversive. It's hidden. You just don't, you can't, it's not structured the same way, but the same thing happens.
Yeah, because it's human nature. We want to influence and we want to, you know, to live the way we want to live. And I would say one observation that I've had years ago, and it's amazing to me, there could be all kinds of explanations, but in Israel, you can be anything on the political spectrum. There are 12, 13 parties in the Knesset, right? It could be all kinds of shades, but religiously, it's very black and white. It's you either belong to the religious camp or the secular camp. In America, it's flipped. Religiously, anything. You know, I belong to GEM, the Greenport Ecumenical Ministries. I mean, everybody is there. And then, but politically, it's black or white. You're either here or there. So I don't know what exactly that's you know, what it means exactly and how it translates, but it's very interesting that the two free societies somehow have they're restricted somewhere too in their conversation in some aspect.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Elaine.
I just want to say, in my opinion, that Dr. Sinclair is really not saying what he'd like to say.
You're
Because
saying that Dr. Sinclair is not so clear?
not saying, right, he'd really like to say that the religious right has a stranglehold on everything in Israel. I mean, he says more tribal. Now, that's a hot word. Jingoistic. Who says that? He's not coming out and saying that their foot is on the neck of the people and they work very hard to get their way, and they've gotten their way. It's what they do in Muncie, in Lakewood. They buy up the property, they squeeze the middle class and the upper middle class. They take control of the legislature. You don't hear anything, but they're doing their bad work. And you can talk till you're blue in your face, and they'll continue to do it until Hashem makes a miracle or
So
something.
you're saying that the ultra-Orthodox in Israel do the same
Yes.
thing? They just
They'll-
play the political game. They know
Yes.
how to play the
Yes.
political
They
game.
know how, they're good at it, and they will never give up power. Never say never, but those folks will never give up power.
No, and they're very strong because they're very politically, they're
And they're
like,
scary.
they're
Yeah,
so united that way
yeah,
that, of course, politically, they make a
they're
very
scary.
strong.
People
You know,
don't want to go
yeah.
up against them.
And I did not finish reading Dr. Sinclair's
Right, yes, let's keep
piece.
going.
I don't know why I stopped. Maybe the paper didn't scroll down and I thought it was the end.
Right, yeah, no.
What
no,
he
scroll
says
it down.
is we should no longer be asking how to connect American Jews to this story. We need to ask how American Jews should respond to this story.
Hmm.
Response to Israel's direction should be done in the spirit of true dialogue with Israelis
Mhm.
and with American Jews who hold different opinions. That means arguing, expressing opinions, taking strong stances, but also being open to listening and truly hearing those who think differently. In essence, what I am proposing is a double challenge. To the established forms of Israel education, it's a challenge to have responding to Israel's direction as a much more central part of the educational enterprise. But to those who disagree with aspects of Israel's direction, it's a challenge to have them think about how to respond in ways that other Jews and Israelis can hear them. In Dewey's terms, how to have those responses be educative rather than just venting. Ultimately, the goal is to have as many Jews as possible actively trying to impact and be impacted by the amazing, crazy, frustrating, imperfect project that we call Israel.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think that's what we're doing here.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. It really is about understanding that imperfection. It's in one of the earliest sessions we've had, we talked about this perception of Israel itself, like if if it's not the hero that won the 1967 war, the 1948, all the wars, it means that it's all the way kind of a villain. So it's either a villain or a hero. I think it's somewhere in the middle. There's a, or I would say Israel is responding to its circumstances. It's a traumatized people, but not just traumatized, very educated, very, wealthy in so many culturally and everything else. But it's also, it's very traumatized. And I think that's what he's saying. Be more compassionate, be in a real conversation and hear where they come from, so yeah, I would agree with that aspect for sure. Yeah. Paul?
Well, when we made our first trip to Israel in 1985, it was before the Intifada, and we went to the West Bank. It was on, there was a synagogue which had a Roman mosaic that we went to see. And before the Intifada, it was the West Bank was I thought it was peaceful. I didn't feel any I didn't feel any tension there. And then Francis worked in Gaza, and he also worked in Jerusalem, and he had Palestinian friends, gay friends, who had never been in a Jew's home, and he brought them to a Purim party, and he was and he had a friend, a Jewish woman's dress, which was a little lumpen proletariat, or I don't know what you call it. Anyway, and these Palestinian friends, they went to the sister's closet and got hats with feathers and festive to go to the this Purim party, and a Hasid passed them on the street, and he followed them to the party. He was to this gay mixed party, and he was having a great time.
Yeah,
so
I want to do, if you don't mind, this one more source number 5, that actually looks at both for more, I would say,
traditional.
closer look. Let me just share. Okay, yeah, there's 2 perspectives of Elliot Abrams, American Jews and Israel are drifting apart. What's the reason? And Daniel Gordis, how American Jews have detached themselves from Jewish memory. So it basically looks at both aspects. If American Jews and Israel are drifting apart, which means that it's mainly maybe on America, or the American Jews drifting apart, but Daniel Gordis definitely is looking at from the perspective of American Jews detaching themselves. Let's see who would like to read that. Adrian, would you read that? Actually, let's just say for Elliot Abrams is an American diplomat and lawyer who has served in a variety of foreign policy positions for U.S. presidents beginning 1948. Rabbi Daniel Gordis is senior vice president at Shalem College, Jerusalem, and the author of numerous books on Jewish thought and political currents in Israel, beginning 1959. He is considered more on the kind of conservative, closer to Israel in perspective, and he lives today in Jerusalem. Okay.
And his father, Rabbi Gordis, was the rabbi at East Midwood Jewish Center in Brooklyn. I went there for a USY conference.
Yeah, yeah,
And
they have few
met him.
generations of rabbis, yes.
Abrams, what is to be done reversing the major demographic trends in the American Jewish population, for example, by increasing endogenous endogenous marriage does not seem to be in the cards. Where the Jewish state is concerned, should Israel and its American supporters rely more heavily on the Orthodox, whose sense of community and of closeness to Israel is intact, turn outward and work more closely with evangelical Christians, reach out to growing population groups like Hispanics and Asians, seek to strengthen Hashbara, Israel advocacy programs, whose goal is to increase support for Israel among the American public in general. Each of these suggestions has its value and its limitations, but the beginning of wisdom is surely to understand that the problem is here in the United States. The American Jewish community is more distant from Israel than in past generations because it is challenging, is in significant ways growing weaker, and is less inclined and indeed less able to feel the expressed solidarity with other Jews here and abroad.
Okay, so he's not, saying what exactly caused them, but he's saying that this is the reality. It's drifting apart, and of course, many articles have been written about that, but definitely something about the education. But let's read Gordis first, and then we can.
So this is where we find ourselves today. Widespread ignorance about the Jewish past and an abandonment of the modes of Jewish communal behavior that once instilled in Jews of all kinds a reflexive commitment to peoplehood, coupled to a discourse in which the fact that Israel is beset by enemies, still sworn to its destruction, is regarded as not worth mentioning by alleged lovers of Judaism and Jews.
Okay, so I mean, clearly they're coming from different perspectives. They both saying there's something about the Jewish population in America, the next generation. They're not getting something in their education. But what Gordis is saying, basically, if I have to summarize his words, is haven't the Jewish people suffered enough? Give us some Rahmanas, we're finally in a place where we're not persecuted. Stop persecuting us in other ways. We need to not be persecuted anymore.
Cut us some slack.
Cut us some slack. And I have to say, for me, over the years too, since I've moved to New York when I was young, I would say I'm more and more compassionate. I've always, of course, loved Israel. There's part and parcel of me, but it's not a. I did. I saw the challenges, and today I see where they come from, and I'm more sympathetic that way, and compassionate. Just like realizing what your parents have done for you, or what they had to go through to even bring you to where you are. I think it's a process of maturity. Frankly, it's to see what people have gone through. So that's basically, if I have to summarize this whole session on both parts of it, is I think we need to be more compassionate towards each other, because even Israelis should feel more compassionate about, even if we talk about American Jews, in their view, American Jews have money, they live comfortably, but Jews in the diaspora in general, and in America in particular, have their own challenges. You know, anti-Semitism, or you know, being a living in a place where you can never really have a Shabbat experience or Yom Kippur experience, or you know, so you know, if you don't live in a tightly knit religious communities. So it's you know, we both have the strength and challenges, and I think we need to be more compassionate towards each other, understand that we're one body that needs to heal, and let's have a positive conversation more than negative. Susan?
Just for perspective, you know, what we're going through in this country right now, the upheaval that we're
Right.
going through in this country right
Exactly.
now, we're talking about, you know, we talk about how young this country is,
Right.
Mm,
and then
Mhm.
think about how young Israel is.
Right.
You know, and we
Right.
expect Israel to be, we expect them to be something already that, you know, we're not. You know, it's like,
Right.
yeah.
Right, exactly. It's it's a process. And I feel the same way in America. That is my other half, my other part, that I come from a culture that I saw how it could be destructive when we take for granted each other. And I feel like in America, people take for, you know, really for granted the strong boat, the stable boat that we're all on. And if we keep, you know, poking holes in it and thinking we're punishing the other side, guess what? It just doesn't work this way. That's all, you know, with Jews and Palestinians, Democrats and Republicans, you know, Jews who are religious and Jews who are not. I mean, it's all these components, and it's very complex, and it's one big operation. And that's why it takes a long time to really grasp the big picture in the Jewish people. But there is a big picture and one big body. I'll give you just actually one more example. When I was in Helsinki, going to Israel, and I got stuck that day, I wanted to go to synagogue. Actually, I actually went on the way back. I had the day, and I went to synagogue, and I couldn't get in to the synagogue because it was fortified and it had guards, and you had to submit your name a day or two before you come, so they approve you. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I've seen this in Europe, you know, many times, in Rome and in other places, in Poland, and but that's the difficulty. But and who was the guard there? Israeli, you know, military, you know, ex-military. It was clear. We kind of got to talking. Of course, you know, people who served in the Israeli army and combat unit then get positions in Jewish congregation around the world to protect them. So it's two hands that have to wash each other.
Right.
The two cherubs that have to keep talking to each other.
Yeah, there are opportunities. Susan's point was a good one about the age of our country and the age of Israel. I think there are opportunities. And the last session is on Jewish continuity, and not only not for us about procreation, but about other things. There are actually things we can do.
Well, Hebrew school.
That's right.
We're going to start there.
Pretty important. Yep,
Kinder to one another.
absolutely.
The key.
Starts with us, but let's end it on a little loftier
Okay.
note.
Okay, let me just stop the recording. Thank you very much, everybody, for
Ellen has her hand up.
participating.